a team of folks in the World Trade Center who were all still there. And so I was driving to work knowing that I was expected to be a leader and be a manager and be available for my people. I didn't know how upset people were going to be. We didn't know what was going to happen to the financial markets. And yet at the same time, I was terribly worried about my friends and colleagues. And as we stood in a conference room, we had a large television screen in the office at the time. This was it's long ago enough that it wasn't a television; it was like a projector. So we had rolled down the projector, we were watching TV, and we were watching what was going on. And my whole office had assembled in the conference room, and it was this super sobering, very quiet moment. And what's so odd is I'm watching the second tower. I worked in the second tower that went down. I worked at 2 World Trade. And so I'm standing in my conference room in the back. I'm watching the second tower go down, and I didn't realize it, but I was sobbing. And my operations manager looked at me and said, "You don't want to do that here, go to the ladies' room." And because, of course, I was in charge. And so it was a pretty complicated day for me. And that moment it started like any other day, just like everybody else, and then ended in just terrible tragedy. And watching what I thought at the time, and I think the reason I reacted so stringently, as everyone in the country did, but is that I knew a lot of people who were sitting in the building, and I knew they were there that day, and I actually thought they had all died. And so it was very sobering to watch what I thought was the death of a number of my friends on television.
Wow. Yeah.
So that was my morning. Yeah.
Very tragic morning.
It was a very intense day.
Yeah.
It was a very intense day. Yeah.
Okay, so another question I had was, could you have ever imagined something so horrible could have happened to America like this?
Not really. Although one of the things, I said I watched what I thought was a bunch of my friends dying that day. One of the reasons it wasn't that is that there were people who did. And when I worked in the World Trade Center, we had a man who worked with us named Rick Rescorla, who was the head of security for Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley at that time was the largest tenant of the World Trade Center. So we had about 25 to 30,000 people working in the 5 buildings. And we had 44 to World Trade. So from 62, I think it was, up to 79. Is that right? We had a number of floors. The executive floors were there. I worked on 62, but I think we might have had 45 to 79. I think those were our numbers. And so we practiced. Rick Rescorla had been a military guy who we hired after the first bombing of the World Trade Center. And Rick had set up a drill that every quarter, every floor in the building practiced what we would do in an emergency. And the way it worked was every floor had a floor captain, and we had a drill, and the way it worked is the top floor to 79 started first, so they would get down the building. When the last person out of that floor, who was the floor captain, got to the next floor down, they knocked on the door, and that floor started evacuating. And so that was practiced a number of times every quarter while I worked in the World Trade Center. So even though it seemed implausible, it certainly was never completely impossible because we were practicing for the event.
Yeah.
And in fact, that practicing saved literally thousands of lives that day.
That's great.
It was turned out to be quite fortuitous because we had that system in place. When the World Trade Center folks, the Port Authority folks, came on the intercoms and said, everything's okay, it's the other buildings, stay in place, Rick Rescorla got a megaphone and stood in the hallway and shouted up the stairs, evacuate, evacuate, get out right now. And because he did that, thousands of people lived. We only lost 12 employees that day when we could have lost 10,000 easily.
Yeah.
So it's one of the reasons the casualties in that building were as low as they were, because of that evacuation. And unfortunately, Rick he was the last guy out, so he didn't make it. But and I get emotional every time I talk about it, because Rick was the guy I rode up in the elevator with every morning. So we got to the work at the same time every day. We're on the same train probably, and I rode up with him every day and he was an amazing guy and literally was responsible for the saving of so many people. So no, I didn't think so, but yet we were prepared.
That's great.
I think you live in denial to a certain extent, just to function every day. And I think that was true even after the attacks. I lived in New York after 9/11. I was away when it happened. I moved back about a year and a half later. And after that, Manhattan was sort of forever changed. When I went to work every day, I didn't wear my Jimmy Choos on the subway anymore. I wore my running shoes. And I carried them in my purse so that if I needed to get out of there, I could. And I think every New Yorker was changed in that way forever as a result of that attack. So.
Yeah. So another question I had was, what's one thing you have taken away from the horrible events personally?
I think that, and I share this with a number of my friends who were actually there that day and who worked with me for over the years. I think we all walked away from that and have healed through that with a sense of life is short and life is not a given and life is not to be taken for granted, because you just don't know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And I think that we all, and I think that may be just part of getting older, but I think that we all are looking at life now going, wait, what am I waiting for? What am I waiting for? If I want to do something, why am I not doing it?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big part of it. And also just the understanding the value and importance of securing ourselves in the world. And that has particular pertinence, I think, this morning after what happened yesterday with the Syria situation. Yeah. So I think all of us sort of became a little harder around. I am a dyed-in-the-wool, serious liberal Democrat, and so the idea of military action before 9/11 was something I would have just automatically resisted. Not so much anymore. I often said after the event, if we figure out where Osama bin Laden is, I'll push the button. Because I think we all became much more serious about what can happen and what we need to do to protect ourselves as a nation. So I hope that answers your question.
No, yes, it does. Okay, this question has to relate to that, but how do you think the tone of America changed after 9/11?
I think dramatically. I think we went from a nation that sort of lived in a sort of a Camelot mentality. Nothing could happen here. It happens at other places, but not here. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a rude awakening for us as a country. I also think it changed the next generation pretty seriously.
Yeah.
How old are you?
15.
Okay, so you were born into a country that, or very shortly before, you were born right before all this happened. I don't even think you would have been old enough to remember it. I don't know, do you?
I was born in 2002.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're too young to remember.
Yeah.
And yet you've lived your entire life in a country that knows it can be attacked.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up my entire life in a country that never had been in my lifetime. So it's a very different change. change. I think for us culturally and socioeconomically, I think it made a huge impact. But I think most importantly, it made us aware that we're not immune. And, frankly, we're incredibly fortunate because this happens all over the world every day. A 9/11 happens somewhere in the world every single day almost. And we live in, blissful ignorance most of the time.
Yeah.
But I think 9/11 changed that to a certain extent. I really did.
Definitely. This also has to do with that question. How do you think it changed the daily lives of people? I know how you talked about how it changed a lot of New Yorkers and how they thought and how they were more prepared.
Yeah.
But how do you think it changed across the nation for people?
Well, I think going back to what I just said, I think that everybody in America, suddenly the idea of a terrorist attack was real.
Yeah.
We had certainly watched suicide bombers in Israel for decades. We had seen terrorist attacks all over the world. And while we were horrified, it wasn't personal. I think it became really personal that day. There were not a lot of people in this country who didn't know someone who was immediately impacted or who had worked in or lived in New York. And so, because that is such a hub of American business. I mean, I had people reach out to me via text and phone that I hadn't talked to in years, just because they knew I worked there. So I think that it caused us as a country to sort of look at things and realize that we needed to be more diligent and that we needed to live our lives a little bit more realistically about what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So, and then everybody in New York was wearing their running shoes everywhere.
Yeah.
Make getting to work a whole lot easier. But we didn't have to be sitting in the park or running around in our Jimmy Choos. We just put them on at the office.
Yeah. Okay. How have you changed since 9/11? I know you've gone into detail about how you have, but can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. I think that. Did I miss something?
No, you're good.
Okay. I think that for me personally, I sort of began to think of my work in a different way. It's very easy when you're in my industry and particularly in New York. We work all the time. It's like 12, 14 hours a day is no big deal. And so I think for me, it really highlighted what's important. Where do I want to spend my time? What do I want to be doing with my life? And immediately after, my immediate response was, I want to get in my car and drive to New York and make sure everything was okay. So while everyone was fleeing New York, my reaction was, I can't believe I'm not there and I need to get there to take care of the people that I care about.
Yeah.
And so it actually meant we moved back to New York as soon as I could swing it professionally. And then we lived there for a number of years afterwards, and just in 2009 moved out of the city. And having moved out of the city, it really does, I think it continues to impact us all in the sense of, living life for the now. And how much do I work versus how much do I live, and I work less now and live more, which is great.
Yeah. That's good. That's really good.
Way better.
Yeah.
Way better.
Okay, so how about we just turn a little bit lighter and let's just talk about just a little bit of your younger life. So, where were you born?
I was born in Fairfield, Alabama, so not very far from where you are now. And my parents lived in that Midfield, Fairfield area when I was very little, and then we moved to Rock Mountain Lakes out near Bessemer when I was in the 5th grade. So, and we lived there. I lived there with my mom until I graduated from college in '86. So I lived in Alabama all my life until I was done with college.
Okay.